Aristotle's Poetics, Poetics, stands as one of the most influential works of literary theory and criticism in the Western tradition. Composed in the 4th century BCE, this treatise outlines Aristotle's systematic approach to the nature of literary art, particularly tragedy. Although originally more expansive, only the section on tragedy and a few scattered references to comedy survive. Nevertheless, Poetics has profoundly shaped aesthetic thought, dramatic theory, and literary criticism for over 2 millennia. In this essay, we will explore the historical and philosophical context of the Poetics, examine its structure and key concepts, provide a detailed analysis of its core themes, especially tragedy, and reflect on its enduring legacy in literature and beyond. 1. Historical and philosophical context. 1.1. Aristotle and the Greek intellectual world. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, a student of Plato and tutor to Alexander the Great, was one of the most prolific thinkers of antiquity. His works spanned logic, metaphysics, ethics, natural sciences, politics, and aesthetics. The Poetics emerges from this rich intellectual environment, reflecting Aristotle's empirical methodology and his desire to classify and analyze phenomena of all kinds, including literature. Unlike his teacher Plato, who distrusted poetry as a mere imitation of the world of forms and a potential source of moral corruption, Aristotle sought to understand and justify the role of poetry in society. While Plato saw poets as imitators twice removed from truth, Aristotle approached mimesis, imitation, as a natural human activity with cognitive and emotional value. 1.2. The cultural role of drama in classical Athens. The Poetics reflects the central place of dramatic performances in Athenian culture. The theater was not merely entertainment, it was a civic and religious institution. Tragedies were performed during festivals like the Dionysia and were often based on mythological or historical themes. Figures like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides had defined the genre in the 5th century BCE, and Aristotle's Poetics, attempts to distill their methods into a coherent theory. 2. Structure and content of the Poetics. The extant Poetics is divided into 26 short chapters, written in a terse and analytical style. Scholars believe Aristotle originally planned a 2-part work, one on tragedy and one on comedy. Only the first part survives, and it focuses primarily on tragedy, epic poetry, and some comments on other genres like dithyramb and comedy. Nash 2.1. Definition of poetry and mimesis. Aristotle begins by defining poetry as a form of mimesis, imitation, just like painting or music. However, poetry imitates not the physical appearance, but human actions, emotions, and life. He distinguishes between various forms of poetry, tragedy, comedy, epic, based on 3 criteria: the medium of imitation, rhythm, language, harmony; the objects of imitation, noble or base characters, like the mode of imitation, narrative or dramatic. For Aristotle, mimesis is not negative or deceptive. Instead, it satisfies a fundamental human desire to learn and understand. Tragedy, in particular, provides intellectual and emotional insight into the human condition. 2.2. The 6 elements of tragedy. Aristotle identifies 6 essential elements of tragedy. 1. Plot, mythos, the structure of events. 2. Character, ethos, the moral and psychological traits of individuals. 3. Thought, dianoia, themes, arguments, and ideas. 4. Diction, language and style. 5. Melody, melo, musical component, especially choral odes. 6. Spectacle, opsis, visual effects and stagecraft. Plot is given primacy. Aristotle declares that plot is the soul of tragedy, as it governs the unfolding of action and the emotional impact on the audience. 3. Analysis of key concepts in the Poetics. 3.1. Tragedy. Defined. Aristotle famously defines tragedy as an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not narrative, through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation, catharsis of these emotions. This definition contains several key components. Serious action. Tragedy deals with weighty matters, life, death, fate. Completeness. A tragedy must have a beginning, middle, and end. Magnitude. The action must be significant and meaningful. Artistic language. Tragedy uses verse, particularly iambic trimeter and lyrical passages. Performance-based. It is dramatized, not recounted. Emotional impact. It purges or purifies emotions, pity and fear. through catharsis. Header 3.2. The structure of plot. Unity and peripeteia. The best plots, according to Aristotle, exhibit unity of action. They must revolve around a single, complete sequence of events with a coherent cause and effect structure. He distinguishes between simple and complex plots, favoring the latter because they involve peripeteia, reversal, a sudden change from one state to its opposite, e.g. from prosperity to misfortune. Anagnorisis, recognition, a discovery or revelation that leads to a change in understanding. Pathos, suffering, a destructive or painful action, e.g. death, injury. A complex plot weaves these elements to create emotional depth and moral insight. 3.3. Hamartia and the tragic hero. The protagonist of a tragedy is typically a tragic hero, a character who is neither perfectly virtuous nor wholly villainous, but whose misfortune arises from hamartia, a mistake or error, often mistranslated as tragic flaw. This error leads to downfall, but it is not necessarily a moral failing. It can be an act based on ignorance or misjudgment. Famous examples include Oedipus, who unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother, and Agamemnon, who sacrifices his daughter for favorable winds. Aristotle emphasizes that the hero's fall should evoke pity, because the hero is admirable, and fear, because we recognize similar vulnerabilities in ourselves. This emotional engagement is central to tragedy's psychological effect. One of the most debated concepts in Poetics is catharsis. Aristotle claims that tragedy affects the proper purgation of pity and fear. But what does he mean by catharsis? Scholars have proposed several interpretations. Medical, an emotional purge that restores balance, like a physician expelling excess humors. Moral, a cleansing or purifying effect that leaves the viewer emotionally or ethically uplifted. Intellectual, a clarification or learning process. By experiencing emotions in a controlled setting, we gain understanding. Whatever the precise meaning, catharsis justifies tragedy's emotional intensity by framing it as beneficial rather than harmful, in direct contrast to Plato's suspicion of dramatic art. Language and style. Diction. Aristotle views language as a powerful vehicle for dramatic effect. He praises metaphor as the highest form of poetic language and insists on clarity without vulgarity. Good diction combines elevated language with natural speech appropriate to characters and situations. Rhythm and melody, especially in the chorus, also enhance the emotional resonance of the play. But Aristotle warns that spectacle, stage effects, is the least artistic element, relying on external devices rather than the internal logic of the plot. 3.6. Epic versus tragedy. Aristotle compares tragedy to epic poetry, with Homer as the model epic poet. While both genres imitate serious actions and use verse, epics are longer and rely on narrative rather than performance. Tragedy, by contrast, achieves greater concentration, unity, and emotional immediacy. Aristotle judges tragedy superior to epic because it is more effective in achieving catharsis and requires greater skill to produce. Error 4. Philosophical implications of the Poetics. Format 1. Art as knowledge. In contrast to Plato's condemnation of art as deceitful mimesis, Aristotle affirms the epistemological value of poetry. He argues that poetry is more philosophical and more serious than history, because it deals with universals, what could or should happen, rather than particulars, what did happen. Tragedy presents generalized truths about human nature, morality, and fate. It allows audiences to reflect on ethical dilemmas, emotional struggles, and the limits of human agency in a structured and meaningful way. 4.2. The ethical dimension. Aristotle's view of tragedy is closely tied to his ethics. Just as the Nicomachean Ethics explores the cultivation of virtue and the role of rational deliberation, Poetics presents tragedy as a medium that examines human choices and their consequences. The tragic hero's error, hamartia, arises in the tension between reason and emotion, individual agency and divine will, or moral intentions and tragic outcomes. By watching such struggles, audiences engage in ethical contemplation. 5. Influence and legacy. 5.1. Antiquity and the Middle Ages. While Poetics had limited influence in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, it was preserved through Arabic translations and commentaries, especially by thinkers like Averroes. It re-entered the Western tradition through Latin translations in the 13th century. 5.2, the Renaissance and Neoclassicism. The Renaissance saw a revival of interest in Aristotle's aesthetics. Italian critics such as Lodovico Castelvetro interpreted the Poetics as a set of prescriptive rules, emphasizing the three unities, action, time, place, that were later codified in French neoclassicism. Corneille, Racine, and other dramatists adhered to Aristotelian principles, often rigidly, believing they represented universal standards of taste. 5.3, Romanticism and Modern Criticism. Romantics like Goethe and Schiller rejected the formal constraints derived from Aristotle, advocating for emotional spontaneity and individual expression. However, even rebellion, they remained in dialogue with Aristotelian ideas. In the 20th century, theorists like Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan reinterpreted tragedy in psychological terms, while modern dramatists like Arthur Miller adapted Aristotelian ideas to new contexts. Miller's Death of a Salesman, for instance, presents an ordinary man with tragic dignity, a modern everyman version of Aristotle's noble hero. Structuralist and post-structuralist critics, including Northrop Frye, Stephen Greenblatt, and Terry Eagleton, have revisited Poetics through the lenses of mythology, power, and ideology. Aristotle remains a foundational text in literary theory, philosophy, and aesthetics. Its influence endures not because it offers rigid formulas, but because it invites us to think deeply about the nature of storytelling, the purpose of art, and the emotional and moral complexities of human life. By analyzing tragedy's structure, function, and impact, Aristotle offers a compelling vision of art as a vital means of understanding ourselves and our world. Whether embraced, modified, or challenged, his insights continue to resonate in the works of playwrights, poets, and critics across centuries.